The theme music from a movie based on an Agatha Christie novel that featured Hercule Poirot. And I think it's a good piece of music to get us started on today's show. I'm sure we'll be talking a bit about Agatha Christie, maybe a little about Hercule Poirot, and probably many, many more as we talk about mystery books that feature gardens and gardening. Our guest for this next hour is Marta McDowell. She teaches landscape history and horticulture at the New York Botanical Garden, a very popular lecturer and writer. Her books, and I'm going to give you a list of some of her books, is just a great list. Unearthing the Secret Garden is one. Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life. Another, The World of Laura Ingalls Wilder. A New York Times best-selling book titled All the President's Gardens, and Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life, which is now in its 9th printing. She was the 2019 recipient of the Garden Club of America's Sarah Chapman Francis Medal for Outstanding Literary Achievement. And we're going to talk with her about her latest book, and it is titled Gardening Can Be Murder: How Poisonous Poppies, Sinister Shovels, and Grim Gardens have inspired mystery writers. And as we talk with her, I hope you'll join in. Love to hear from you. Do you like mysteries, but with botanical elements to them? I kind of do. You have questions about one of Marta's other books? Join in. Give us a call. The number's 800-642-1234. Or you could send an email to talk@wpr.org. That's talk@wpr.org. Marta McDowell, welcome. Thank you for taking time to be with us today.
Thank you, Larry. It's my pleasure.
I'll tell you what, I really enjoyed your book. It's fun. It was a lot of fun to read, and brought and sort of gave me some new insights into how gardens are used in mysteries, which I hadn't really thought that much about until I read your book. But I'm wondering, just how did you get interested in gardening? I mean, look at the career you've had.
Well, let's see. My great aunt Mary had a wonderful garden at her home. She lived in Atlanta, Illinois, and I think that was the first garden that really struck me. But I didn't really have much of a garden until I had a house of my own. So I really started gardening seriously in my 20s, and I've gardened like that ever since.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. Well, and as I've indicated, you've written a number of books about historical gardens. Emily Dickinson, Laura Ingalls Wilder, our presidents. What intrigues you about those gardens?
Well, I guess you can tell, Larry, I like to garden and I like to read. So the whole, looking at gardeners who are also authors or vice versa, really just happened accidentally. This is my second career. I was on a business trip. I was visiting insurance agencies across Massachusetts, and I had a open afternoon, and I just kind of bumped into Emily Dickinson's home in Amherst, Massachusetts, and found out she was a gardener and thought, gee, that would be interesting to write about. It's like I always say, Emily Dickinson changed my life.
That's a wonderful story. Well, here you are with your new book, Gardening Can Be Murder. Certainly a different course. Where did that idea come from?
Well, actually started quite a while ago. I read a book called Mulch. It's by Anne Ripley, who I don't think she's with us anymore, but she was a Colorado garden writer. And, this was her first mystery, and she made the protagonist, you write about what you know. So she made the protagonist a garden writer. And the plot, sort of revolved around her trying to mulch her garden not having enough leaves because she wanted to use shredded leaves, and went out and picked up other people's leaves around the neighborhood, and oops, one of those bags had body parts in it. So, and it just struck me. I thought, gee, I'll bet there are a lot of gardening mysteries, and I've always loved to read mysteries. It's sort of my brain candy, and so it just kind of started there. I started kind of keeping an eye out for them, and then during COVID, I thought I gotta do something. So I decided that would be the perfect pandemic project.
Well, you know, I visited with a lot of authors over the last year or so, and most of the books were written during COVID, or a good many of them. Let's put it that way. And people made pretty good use of their time, and you did as well with this particular book. So, how did you go about the research on this? I think you talk a little about it at the beginning.
Yeah, so I had quite a few on my shelves that I had read over the years. Because again, this wasn't a brand new idea. And then I had some friends who were big murder mystery readers. So I asked them. And then as I started doing, during lockdown, I was doing a lot of Zoom talks, which I had never done. I didn't even know what Zoom was.
Yeah.
And I would tell people what I was working on, and I would get out of the blue, someone would send me their list of their favorite gardening murder mysteries. So I had no intention of crowdsourcing this, Larry, but it sort of happened that way.
Andrea and Madison's been waiting a bit. Let's just get to Andrea. You've got some recommendations, Andrea?
Oh, yes. One of my favorite books in this mystery garden crossover genre is The White Garden, a novel of Virginia Woolf and Sissinghurst, by Stephanie Barron. Have you ever read it?
It's marvelous. I knew Stephanie Barron from her books about Jane Austen. So she also wrote a series with Jane Austen and her sister solving murders. And so I was thrilled to find The White Garden. I have been lucky enough to visit Sissinghurst, and I'm interested in that whole crowd of the Bloomsbury group. So it is a really good read, and you're right. It touched all of my interests. So it was literary and gardening and historic garden.
The White Garden. Andrea, did you have something else you wanted to recommend?
Yeah, in terms of humor, I've gotten a real kick out of Rhapsody in Green by Charlotte Mendelson. She's a modern essayist, and she's just a hoot. I have her book with tons of little paper markings where she said something very funny.
I love it. Martha, are you familiar with Rhapsody in Green?
I am not, and I've just scribbled it down, so I will certainly pick that one up.
Andrea, thank you so much. Appreciate your call. Well, as long as we're on callers here, let's go to Martha in Menominee. Hi, Martha.
Hey, Larry. Okay, here's one for you. This is a Chicago writer who was born in River Falls, Wisconsin. So there's a little home state tie-in here. And the book is called The House by the Side of the Road. And this author won an award for her first novel. This is her second novel. But the whole plot and the whole solving of this murder mystery in this book hedges on certain narcissus plantings in the yard. And I don't want to give away any more. So, but if you read the book, pay attention to the gardener.
And who is the author, Martha?
Her name is Jan Gleiter, and she's out of Chicago.
Oh, Martha.
Okay,
thanks.
that is a new one for me, and I really appreciate that. I'm always on the lookout. I have a growing list, and I've put my whole list is on my website, and I have been adding to it. And this one I wouldn't have picked up from just I always look at the shelf of new mysteries in my library every time I go. This week I read one called The Garden Plot. So that one is like, okay, I'll bet that's one for me. But I would not have picked up on this, The House by the Side of the Road. So I will definitely put that on my wish list.
Well, I'll bring one up for you as long as we're at it. John Sanford, great mystery writer, and there was, and now I can't think of the title, but there's a series of John Sanford's where he uses the protagonist is Virgil Flowers, and Virgil is out to check on a murder. And there was a young woman singer involved, and he couldn't find her, so he went to the father's house, and the guy was out in the garden working in the garden. And talked to him, and eventually he finds the daughter, but she's not the killer, and there are several other people that weren't the killers. And then he goes back to the father, and the father, whose wife had left with a lover, supposedly, he gets an idea and he does some testing, and this was out in the country, and it turns out that he is able to determine that there's something under the garden. And under the garden, the guy had killed his wife and lover, and he was a heavy equipment operator too, and he dug a big hole and stuck the car in it with them inside, and then covered it and made a garden on top of it. And it caught me completely by surprise at the end. So now I've given away the whole thing, but I haven't given away the top title of the book because I can't remember it.
So now it's a scavenger hunt, Larry, not for the murderer, but for what's the book. I'll bet somebody will call in with the title.
Somebody will probably call in with the title. Marta McDowell, our guest today, her book is titled Gardening Can Be Murder. Love to hear from you. If you got a recommended mystery that involves gardens or gardening, I hope you'll join in at 800-642-1234, or you can email us to talk@wpr.org. I'm Larry Mealer for Garden Talk on WPR News. Great to have you along for this edition of Garden Talk. Larry Mealer here. And just to mention, later on in the next hour, actually, we'll be talking about growing and caring for succulents. But right now, we're in the murder mystery business as it relates to gardening with our guest, Marta McDowell. Her book, her latest book, Gardening Can Be Murder, How Poisonous Poppies, this is the subtitle, How Poisonous Poppies, Sinister Shovels, and Grim Gardens Have Inspired Mystery Writers. And by the way, I like how you organized your book. Talk about the various sections of the book that you have.
So, normally if I'm writing a gardening book about an author, let's say, it's pretty easy to organize it because I generally do it with the arc of their life, the way you would do a biography. This one didn't have that, so I had to come up with its own framework, or if you like, a skeleton. So I used the kind of classic elements of a murder mystery. So you have to have a detective, you have some sort of setting, you have, of course, that motive, means, opportunity, you have suspects, you have clues, and of course, you have the mystery writer.
Well, and let's take settings, for example. And gardens often, as you point out, act as kind of as stages. They serve as backdrops, do they not? For all kinds of things.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you mentioned one earlier, yes, it can be the place where you bury the body. But it can also be a place where you have a garden party where, different suspects come together. It can be used as, the kind of historical interest. One of your callers mentioned the White Garden and Sissinghurst, but, that's just one example. You can have historic gardens, you can have made up gardens, so
Yeah.
lots of different ways.
One that I was remembering, Mark Mills' book in 2007, The Savage Garden. That's a set in, isn't it an Italian villa garden? Is there something, by the way, that stands out in an Italian villa garden, as far as you know?
Well, the Italian villa gardens tend to be quite symmetrical. They tend to have rooms, but they also have a lot of symbolism. And I think that's what he used really well in that book, was sort of going through the symbolism of all the statues. Usually there are all sorts of classical statuaries. So he pulled that in, I thought, in a really nice way.
So what was the mystery in there? I'm trying to remember, and I don't remember it. It was a murder.
Yeah, it was a murder. And again, it was a sort of complicated family story. And so he picks up some of the mythology from the garden and sort of plays that into the story of how the murder, or why the murder happened.
I was also intrigued for a variety of reasons when you were talking about garden settings, but they can also shift a series out of its usual location, or add some descriptive layers to it. And Jill Nadeau, the executive producer for the show, and myself are both big fans of Louise Penny. Yes. And I think both of us have read virtually every one of her mysteries. And you point out a couple of them where the investigator, Armand Gamache, is always in Three Pines, but a couple of times he gets out of Three Pines. In one book, one was The Beautiful Mystery, and I think the other one was Trick of the Light.
Yes, absolutely. So Beautiful Mystery, that was the one where he goes out to the monastery, right? The very remote monastery. And so there is a monastery garden that plays, into that story. And again, I think for an author, especially think Louise Penny, she's probably got 20?
More than, 22, I think. Something.
Yeah, 20 plus. So, yes, it's great you get used to Three Pines, and we all love Three Pines, but, I'm sure she wants to say, okay, let's try somewhere else.
Yeah, and you don't mind it, but then you're always kind of glad when Armand gets back to Three Pines.
Yes, absolutely.
But it does give, I guess it gives the mystery writer a chance to try something a little different. I mean, in the end, somebody gets murdered and Armand Gamache figures it out, but it's a kind of a new way of looking at everything. I think the writing in A Trick of the Light, that is set in Three Pines.
Yes, but there are some really important garden scenes that are in Three Pines. She don't always hear, she doesn't always talk about the gardens in Three Pines, so she pulls up some different aspect.
Yeah, she does indeed. Marta McDowell, our guest, maybe you've got a book to share, a mystery that involves gardening, or a favorite one anyway, or maybe you have a question about it. I hope you'll join in. Give us a call. The number's 800-642-1234, or you could email to talk@wpr.org. Ellie in Madison emailed us to say that the book Back to the Garden by Lori King was absolutely her favorite mystery from the last year. Out of the 24 mystery books that she read, she loved that it was a historical fiction as well as a mystery, and the protagonists were really compelling. So back to the garden. And
Yeah, I don't know that one. I like Laurie King. She's written a long series that has a Sherlock Holmes connection. And so I don't know if it's part of that or not, but I'll look that one up as well.
Frank in Springbrook couldn't stay with us, but wonders if you are familiar with the book White Oleander by Janet Fitch.
Yes, absolutely. So White Oleander, she gives away the means, the murder weapon in the title. Oleander being one of those poisonous plants, and it's a great book. It's not a classic murder mystery, but it definitely fits the theme.
Yeah.
Sure, because it's about death and plants.
Veronica in West Alice emailed to say that the Flavia de Luce series of mysteries, in her mind, is the best. The young protagonist is always using plants to solve the crime or create mischief.
Yes, you bet. So that is by a Canadian author, Alan, whose last name escapes me right at the moment. But the series starts out with Sweetness at the Bottom of the Pie. What a great title. And his protagonist starts out, I think she's 11 years old. So he was not going to make the mistake that Agatha Christie made with Miss Marple by starting her out too old. And it's a wonderful series. As your listener wrote, the Flavia is a little naughty. The one I remember is she has an older sister that she has this love-hate relationship with, and she decides she is going to lace her sister's lip gloss with extract of poison ivy.
Oh my goodness! And Jill's letting me know that the author's last name was Bradley.
Oh, thank you.
So,
he's Canadian. I couldn't come up with it.
So what's his first name? The first name
Alan Bradley.
Oh, Alan Bradley. Jill says she loves this particular series. Well, bringing that up reminds me of something you wrote about earlier, which was the Nancy Drew mystery series, and you had a sidebar that I didn't. Somehow I never came upon this or didn't realize it, but the Nancy Drew mysteries, the backstory to the series, is that the author's name was made up.
Yes, I said this in a big room full of people, and I heard someone gasp because there is no Carolyn Keene, at least not one that actually wrote any of the Nancy Drew mysteries.
There were a series of people who wrote them, wasn't there?
Yes, you bet. So these were farmed out, just like the Hardy Boys. These were series that were cooked up by a publisher in Newark, New Jersey. First, Mr. Stratemeyer, and then later his daughter Harriet would come up with an outline of the story. They came up with the idea of Nancy Drew, an outline of the story, and then they'd farm it out. So it's really amazing. So the one that is a garden mystery is called Password to Larkspur Lane. And it was written by a gentleman named Walter Carrig as Carolyn Keene. Walter, better known for the series Victory at Sea. He was the screenwriter. So a very unlikely Carolyn Keene, but there you go.
Was he a flower gardener? Because the book is partly about flower gardening, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, that's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that. The picture I have of him, he's sitting at his typewriter with a cigarette hanging out of his mouth and a little Siamese kitten on his shoulder.
Oh man. Well, we've already mentioned Miss Marple, Agatha Christie's Miss Marple. How tell us how her Miss Marple's horticultural skills play into the plots of the story she's in.
Oh, lots of different ways. So, Miss Marple lives in this fictional village, kind of like Three Pines, right? So,
Yeah.
maybe St. Mary Mead was the prototype for Louise Penny's Three Pines. And in the very first novel, she says, bird watching and gardening, they're great because, you're outside and you can keep an eye on your neighbors and what they're doing. So we get the feeling Miss Marple might be considered the village busybody, but she's certainly very alert to what's going on. And Agatha Christie wrote about her for decades, for something like 5 decades. And so gardening plays in terms of, sometimes it'll be key to the plot. Sometimes she'll be sharing flowers or, she'll notice that a stone is out of place, and that was something in her Japanese garden. So, it's just always fascinating to me to kind of track that.
Oh boy. And Hercule Poirot was not, I mean, she wrote 22 books featuring him. He wasn't really a gardener, but there were books where he used some sort of gardening principle to solve. Did he not?
Yeah, the main one that comes to mind is called Halloween Party. And it's actually the book that was the basis for the latest movie that Kenneth Branagh was in called A Haunting in Venice. But in the book, it's not set in Venice at all. It's set in an English garden, and it's got a rock garden that plays into the plot very closely. And Christie also describes a garden that is actually an actual garden in Ireland called Ilnacullen. So she has Hercule Poirot describe this, and although he doesn't name it, it's clear that that's the garden that she's talking about, or he's talking about. And it turns out that she had visited that garden in Ireland before she wrote the book.
And roses play a role in many books of mysteries, do they not? I think you had as an aside that the rose was the first plant patent was for a rose.
That's true. And the first gardening detective, at least in the English language that I could find, was named Sergeant Cuff, and he was in The Moonstone by Wilkie Collins, and he loved roses. So absolutely adored them.
And thinking about other flowers, Nero Wolfe, Rex Stout, the author, Nero Wolfe led a gardening lifestyle. Explain what appears in those books relating to orchids, because it's pretty fantastic.
Yeah, so if you're an orchid fancier at all, you should try out the Nero Wolfe series. It's a really engaging series. It might not have all 21st century values. It doesn't always have great values related to women, as I recall. But if you can put that aside, they're good reads, and the orchid information is quite accurate because Rex Stout was quite a gardener himself, although not particularly orchids. He especially liked tall bearded irises and daylilies. But there are something like 400 named varieties of orchids in the Nero Wolfe, the canon, if you will.
And he supposedly had a what do I call it now? I'm blanking on the name, but on the top of his roof, he grew orchids.
Oh, yes. Well, Nero Wolfe was an eccentric, and he owned this brownstone in New York City, and, all fictional. And on the top floor, instead of the penthouse, he had a whole series of orchid greenhouses. So you can imagine them, open to the light.
And I think, as you mentioned, he took one case. He always got a lot of money for the cases he took, but he took one case because he was offered 3 black orchids.
Yes. And that one's easy to find because the book is called Black Orchids. And, you have to realize that at the time these were being written, that orchids were quite expensive. You weren't buying them at your local big box store or, your local supermarket. They were really more a rich person's hobby at the time.
Marta McDowell, our guest today, her book, Gardening Can Be Murder. And if you've got a suggestion or maybe a question about a book relating to a mystery relating to gardens, I hope you'll join in. The number's 800-642-1234 or send some email. We've got some good emails here at talk@wpr.org. That's talk@wpr.org. You have another section called, as you mentioned earlier, means. Dial M for mulch, I think, is the subtitle of that time. And there is there's all kinds of things you can use to murder people when you're thinking about gardens.
Well, I was out in my garden this morning. I think here in New Jersey, it's probably around the same temperature you have in Wisconsin. It's hovering just below freezing, but the sun's out, and I always feel like as long as the sun's out, I can get out and do a little bit of garden work. So I was cutting back some plants, with my really sharp head shears. I take him to the hardware store, and he really sharpens up the blade, and you go, yeah, you can kill somebody with this.
So you've got shears, you've got hose would work pretty well, and then you've got the whole string of chemicals that might come into play, and then there's the plants themselves.
Yes. Yeah, my spouse started worrying while I was writing this book. Especially somebody gave me a dish towel that said, "Be nice to me or I'll poison your food."
Yeah, I'd be suspicious, if the husband starts looking into poisonous plants and their application.
Yes, you bet. So, it was really interesting because I started down this road and, so now I'm going to write this chapter about plant poisons. And I realized, well, I'm not a chemist. I'm a gardener, it's like, and, while I know some of this, I thought I'm going to get in hot water. I know I'll make some scientific mistake. But luckily, my cousin is a plant toxicologist at the University of Illinois. So he read my chapter for me to make sure I wasn't going astray.
Tom in Madison, we'll give you a chance to join in. Hi, Tom.
Hi. I guess I have something of a real-life non-mystery that's related to this topic. And I may not have all of the facts of this precisely, but certainly people can look it up. But the gist of it is that Alexander Fleming, who discovered penicillin through from a bread mold and noticed, there's no other things growing here, and then he worked with that mold to develop penicillin. But I believe the first administration of penicillin was for a police officer in Britain who had unfortunately pricked a finger on a rose thorn in undoubtedly some nice English garden. And, eventually he did succumb. But My recollection of that is that this was the first use of penicillin.
Interesting story.
That is very interesting. I know whenever I prune my roses, and I invariably will get scratched, right, with one
Yeah.
of those prickles, and it'll often get a kind of little infection. So I'll have to look into that. I don't know, like, what is the toxin that hits you, but that is, life before penicillin. It was very scary to get any kind of a wound.
It reminds me that that's kind of a nice little aside. And one of the things I enjoyed about your book were the asides. As I mentioned earlier about the Nancy Drew Mysteries, authors.
Well, as you can tell, Larry, I'm kind of interested in everything, which is it's both I suppose, a good, positive and a negative, because I do tend to go down these paths and then find myself like way down in a rabbit hole and go,
How do I get out of this? Just like a mystery writer would sometimes happen to them, him or her. Oh, man. Carol in Molina, Illinois, Molina, Iowa. It's your turn. Hi, Carol.
Hi, I read The Orchid Thief some years ago, and I really liked it. But I don't remember the author, and someone said they made a movie of it.
Yeah.
Yes, The Orchid Thief was Susan. I seem to be good at Orleans, thank you. And the movie was called Adaptation, which was a very strange movie that kind of pulled in the story, but surrounded it with this bizarre plot about a screenwriter who was trying to adapt it. And so it's a movie that I'd recommend, but it's not a standard, just straight adaptation of the book. And The Orchid Thief, is not fiction, it's nonfiction. So again, a little different from what I was doing, because I was concentrating on crime fiction, but it's a wonderful read.
Carol, thank you so much for calling. Appreciate your call. Marta McDowell, our guest today, her book, Gardening Can Be Murder. I'm Larry Mealer for Garden Talk on WPR News. Taking a look at the book, Gardening Can Be Murder, how poisonous poppies, sinister shovels, and grim gardens have inspired mystery writers. Marta McDowell, the author, with us today. You have a suggestion or a question, I hope you'll join in. The number's 800-642-1234, or you could email to talk@wpr.org. Peg in Dodgeville emailed and says, you need to mention Ellis Peters' Brother Cadfael series. He's the consummate monk gardener, and several of the books do revolve around plants as the murder weapon, monk's hood, for example, or give a big clue. Marta, what do you think?
Absolutely. I love the Brother Cadfael series, the Cadfael Chronicles, I think sort of they're known as. It's 21 books. The author wrote them in about a decade. So she was putting out more than a book a year. Wow. Ellis Peters is the author, but that was a pen name for a woman named Edith Pargeter. She was from the city of Shrewsbury in the west of England, very close to Wales. And she was an amateur historian, but they're very well researched, and they're set in the 12th century. So, think of these. They start coming out in the 1970s. She really pegs the subgenre that we now think of as, a historical crime. So she's writing about a 12th century monk he's the herbalist for the monastery. So he has the herb garden, as they'd say in England, the herb garden, as we'd say here. And as your listener mentioned, they're wonderful reads, and they were also a really great series very early on mystery with Derek Jacobi. And so if you get a chance, you can also look up those. They're probably on YouTube or from your public library.
Yeah, that was a PBS series, if I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, back in the day, it's back when like Gene Shalit was the host.
Oh my goodness. Well, I wanted to bring up, we haven't mentioned Sherlock Holmes at all, and I wanted to bring up a little aside that another one of those, you got off, not off on a tangent, but just a nugget of information that I didn't know, that Arthur Conan Doyle, who wrote, of course, the Sherlock Holmes mystery series, when he was studying medicine, you said, he had to take a botany course for his medical degree.
Yeah, so, realize that until fairly recently, certainly all through the 19th century and into the early 20th century, every medical doctor was taking a botany course because most of the medicines were plant-based. They weren't synthetic medicines at that point. So Conan Doyle is studying to be a doctor. He's in Edinburgh, and he's taking this botany course at the Botanical Garden, which is very famous. And I guess they're talking about different possible uses of plants, and he decides he's going to experiment on himself with a treatment for the eye, which is from a yellow flowering vine called gelsemium. Sometimes they'll call it yellow jasmine, but it's poisonous, and he's administering it to himself.
In different doses, as if I'm trying to remember, he would get stronger and stronger to see how much he could do before he went blind or it killed him.
Yeah, so this is like a sample size of one. Probably not a good idea. So we're glad he survived that, or he never would have had all of the wonderful Sherlock Holmes adventures.
Oh, man. I wanted to bring up another little aside. There's a section called Clues, Greed Evidence, or Red Herrings. And I think you get off into where the term red herring came from.
Yeah, herrings evidently were used in the training of foxhounds, and red herrings in particular was some kind of smoking process that would make the herrings turn red. But they try to make sure that the up and coming hounds were not distracted by other scents. So one scent they try would be this herring, which would be a very strong smell, as is fox, I suppose.
that was another little interesting aside. The caretaker gardener. Tell us about The Crocodile Bird by Ruth Rendell.
Yeah, that is Ruth Rendell is maybe was. I'm not sure she's with us anymore, but terrific writer. Really, highly awarded and very good reads. Both her short stories are very gripping. And this was a novel, and one of the main characters is a caretaker at an estate that includes a lot of gardening, and just a wonderful, gripping read right to the end. Probably not the kind you want to read right before you go to bed.
And plants can be forensic evidence, of course, and one of the books you cited was a Tony Hillerman book, The Wailing Wind. And
Yeah.
how plant materials help catch the killer.
Yeah, and this is factually true. There are people who are forensic botanists, and they use plant material, right down to pollen, kind of microscopic things that found on clothing to try to figure out where a murder actually occurred, or was a body moved, or was this suspect involved in some way. And so Hillerman used it very cleverly in that, with these thorny seed pods that were attached to somebody's boot, um, to say, well, this is not something that occurred in the area where we found the body. So, it must have been committed elsewhere.
Yeah, and there was just kind of like one area where those plants were, so he was able to find it all. Proceed with from that. Did you make any surprising discoveries during your research for the book? Probably a lot of them, but
Yeah. I think, it was surprising to me how many, and, they continue, and you can tell from today, there's like how many books have been, involved in this, again, kind of who knew subgenre. So it continues to be something that stimulates mystery writers. I think because it is very rich.
yeah. If you're thinking about the books that you've read in this area, what are your top book suggestions for someone who wants to read about gardening in mystery books?
Well, I loved the book Deacon King Kong, and that is a new book. Here we go again. I'm going to go blank on the author, James McBride. Deacon King Kong is a book that has gardeners, it has gardening, and it has particular plants. If you're looking for a dead body, that's not in there. But there is a shooting right at the start, and there is a mystery all the way through, which is, what's the motive? What caused this crime? And just so beautifully written and so cleverly done. If you want a classic murder mystery, I would suggest, I think, Death in the Garden. Again, a wonderful book by Elizabeth Ironside. It's an English murder mystery. It takes place in sort of a then and now, so there are flashbacks. Really wonderful. And, we've talked about many of them today. I love Christie, I love Ellis Peters. I love Lucy Penny. There are just so many. And, it's why I've assembled a list that keeps on growing.
Well, it was certainly a lot of fun to read your book. I hope it's doing well.
I think so. My publisher said they'd do another one with me. So.
Oh, all right. So it's doing well. Marta, I can tell you it's been an absolute joy talking with you today. Thank you so much for being with us today and for writing the book. Appreciate it very much.
And thank you. Bye-bye.
Marta McDowell, her latest book is Gardening Can Be Murder, How Poisonous Poppies, Sinister Shovels, and Grim Gardens Have Inspired Mystery Writers. Really a lot of fun to read. Coming up, we are going to take a look at succulents and spend the next hour talking about growing succulents, something we can do indoors right now. I'm Larry Mueller for Garden Talk on WPR News. Great to have you with us for this edition of Garden Talk. Here's something you may not know. Today, according to Jeff Robbins, is National Houseplant Appreciation Day. And so it seems like a good time to turn our attention to some houseplants who are also growing outdoors. Succulents have become pretty popular in the last few years. And on Garden Talk today, we'll zero in on succulents a bit and cactus with an expert about what you need to know to be a successful grower. And our guest is John Bagnasco. He has been in the gardening industry for over 50 years, president of Garden America. It's a nationally syndicated radio show. He is also a garden book author and also an amateur rose breeder, and has introduced over a dozen new roses. So as we talk with him, I hope you'll join in. What questions do you have about growing succulents or maybe roses or other plants? I think John can pretty much take any of those plant questions that you might have. Number to call, 800-642-1234. It's 1-800-642-1234. Or send an email to talk@wpr.org. That's talk@wpr.org. John, welcome to the show. John's with us by phone today. Thank you very much for joining us.
Good to be here, Larry. Thanks so much for having me.
You've had a long career in gardening. What got you into it?
It's a long story, but basically I was going to Michigan State University in my junior year, and I was majoring in accounting. And I was in an accounting class. At the end of the class, I thought I could do this the rest of my life, and I hate everything about it. And I was living in a co-op with some other guys, and I used to help one of the guys with his homework every night, and he was majoring in horticulture, and I thought, this is just not fair. His homework is fun. So I went to see my counselor after that class, and he said, well, you're going into your senior year. You have the business background. If you take just hort classes, you can get a degree in horticultural marketing. So I ended up taking only hort classes, got a 4 point so I could raise my average, so I graduated with honors, and the rest is history.
Oh, that's a great story. It's sort of like my own. I was taking a class in radio broadcasting in my senior year, and the professor was also hosting a radio show at WPR, and he asked me if I'd be interested in going on for a graduate degree, but I would have to do the radio program for him while he was in Colorado teaching a course. So that's sort of fell into it a little bit along the way. Well, listen, gardening, I'm sure gardening, or maybe I should say, how has gardening improved your life?
Well, I guess you could say, is gardening my life? Because that's pretty much it. If you have my philosophy has always been, if you have a passion about doing something, you'll be successful if you incorporate it into your work life. And that's pretty much what I've done. Liking plants, I think, changed my life because after waiting 4 or 5 years for a tree wisteria in Michigan to finally bud up and then having a late freeze kill it, I decided I've just got to go somewhere where it doesn't freeze. So we moved to California in 1977, and I've been here ever since. And if you love plants, this is a great place to be.
Susan in Rhinelander has a question for you. Let's go there. Hi, Susan.
Hi, good morning. Thanks for taking the call.
Sure.
I was saying to the screener that I had a bit of a mini disaster this week where even though I've kept a heater in a 3-season porch for several years without a problem, of course I had a circuit breaker blow and I wasn't aware. And it basically took out all of my house plants in that room, which I overwinter and have done so successfully for many years. So it's very tragic if you can hear the sadness in my voice.
Yes.
Yeah, beautiful. Christmas cactuses and the like, which clearly didn't survive. But my question is, I had a 4 foot by 3 foot, a very large Schefflera, which I successfully overwintered, kept it outside all year, and brought it in. Is there any chance at all that that could have survived those cold, cold temps, even if the foliage looks dead? Do you think watering it and just cutting it back?
What do you think, John?
First of all, when plants freeze, especially tropicals, they have thin cell walls, and the cells in those walls burst, and so obviously if the leaves have undergone those cold temperatures, they're dead. So the question is going to be whether or not any of the wood survived. And the one thing you don't want to do is water. You said, maybe I should water it and see if it comes back. Well, the plant can't use water right now. It's under stress from the freeze. So the main thing would be to get it in a warmer area and keep it on the dry side. Only water it when it's completely dry. And if it's still alive, it will come back eventually. I would say in a couple days, if you just took your thumbnail and scraped the bark, if it was still green under there, that would be a good chance that it may come back.
Yeah, I think that's well put. And Susan, what the heck have we got to lose? There's no reason why you shouldn't bring it in someplace warmer and don't water and see what happens. There you go.
And see how much fun it's going to be going out and shopping for new plants.
Yeah, that's the other side of it. In terms of succulents, have you seen an increase in interest in the last few years, John?
Yeah, it depends what types of succulents and where you are in the country or in the world. About 10, 12 years ago in Korea, they were going crazy for new varieties of Echeveria. And they would come to California and buy thousands and thousands of plants at a time for shipping over there. And now they've kind of changed. Either they have their own breeding or the fashion has moved on to different types of plants. And in California, of course, because of the warmer weather, I think it was about maybe 20 years ago now, my friend Deborah Lee Baldwin wrote a book about landscaping with succulents. And that's when it became really popular out here. And then, of course, things that are popular outdoors in warmer climates become popular indoors in other climates. But you do have to learn how to adjust the conditions that they're growing under. Succulents and cactus are highlight plants for the most part. So if you're going to be growing them indoors, you want the varieties that are lower light tolerant. And what I see happening now is there's, just like it's happened with roses, in the last 100 years, there's new breeding going on with succulents. Some breeders out in California, Renee O'Connell and Kelly Griffin, are producing new varieties of succulents that are better as house plants, but also more attractive. I mean, you can take a regular species that might have, say, kind of a bluish green color, and then, develop it so that there's dark purples or yellows or oranges in some of those species. So I think that I think what you say is true, but I think that they've been popular for a while now. So now the trend is moving towards collector's items, and not only rare species, but the newer hybrids.
Okay. You've written, 4 books on succulents, if I'm not mistaken. What's the main attraction for you personally?
Well, I've written 3 books on succulents, 1 book on houseplants, and my passion right now is actually roses, but both of them both roses and succulents can stick you. So I guess maybe pain is the attraction.
Oh,
But through my career, Larry, if you're really interested in plants, it's a whole world that's impossible to learn in 1 or 2 years. So I focused on different families of plants, and I collected and learned about each group, and then would move on to another group. So once I moved to California, I was excited about, being able to grow a lot of the plants we grew in Michigan indoors. I could now grow them outdoors. And cactus and succulents struck my fancy, and I got all 10 volumes of the Euphorbia Journal and read that and collected euphorbias for a while, and then sansevierias for a while, and before I moved on to roses. And I think just learning everything there is about a plant family and its idiosyncrasies and characteristics is something that interests me.
yeah. Here's a question from Jude in Appleton. She has a beautiful Amazon lily. It's about 35 years old. It has mealy bugs, and about once every other month, she has to spray it with 7 and wipe every leaf off. That's fine and clean, but in another few weeks, the mealybugs are back. And she's wondering what else she can do.
Well, I don't know about the 7. For years, people have treated mealybug just by dipping Q-tips in rubbing alcohol, and rubbing them off, and the alcohol, will penetrate the insects' bodies and desiccate them. And, not being that familiar with what's available on indoor plants like I used to be when I was in Michigan, but I know that Bayer used to have a systemic house plant food that you could just put right in the soil, and that is really good at that type of product is really good at deterring sucking insects.
Yeah, I think that's a pretty good piece of advice, John. John Bagnasco has been in the gardening industry for over 50 years, president of Garden America. It's a nationally syndicated radio show. I'm going to ask him about that as well as we move along today. You may have a question. We've zeroed in on succulents and cactus, but taking other questions as well. The number to call, 800-642-1234, or you could email us, and the email address, talk@wpr.org. I'm Larry Mealer for WPR News. Thanks so much for joining us today on Garden Talk. Larry Mealer here with my guest, John Bagnasco, who has been in the gardening industry for over 50 years, president of Garden America, a nationally syndicated radio show, and talking with him today about a lot of things. We've zeroing in a bit on succulents and cactus, but taking other questions as well as we move along today, and I hope you join in. Number to call is 800-642-1234, 1-800-642-1234, or email to talk@wpr.org. That's talk@wpr.org. Love to hear from you. Those who like tequila, John, probably know it comes from a cactus. I wanted to talk a little bit about cactus with you, and other succulents as well, of course. But what are there other commercial uses that succulents have?
Oh, yeah. Aloe was probably the biggest. Aloe gel is used in all kinds of products, from shampoos to skin ointments. So I would say that's the biggest. And, technically tequila's from an agave, which is a succulent, not a cactus. But that's another use, and there's several drinks for that. So, there's all, I was just thinking during the break about all the the different things that are going on with plants today. And I don't know if it's artificial intelligence or if it's the internet making information available, but so many changes are occurring. You know, on our show last week, a caller let me know that she had ordered the new Firefly Petunia. And I don't know if you're aware of that, but it's a petunia that glows in the dark.
Yes.
And I'm thinking, you know, there's just no end to what's happening today. Things are moving so fast, it's hard to keep up.
It is indeed. I'm reading a fascinating book right now on biorhythms and so forth in people, but plants also have various rhythms. And the author, was talking about sunflowers and how sunflowers that are, grown outside, they face the east in the morning, and they turn as it gets dark. They turn and face west.
Yeah. Well, you know, and then there's also the studies on communications with plants and whether plants can actually speak to each other. I remember way back I used to work for a nursery in Detroit called Frank's Nursery. And back then it was in around 1970 when there was a houseplant craze, and Jerry Baker wrote a book called Plants Are Like People. And back then he kind of supposed that you could talk to plants and treat them as you would people. And even though it sounded crazy back then, you know, a lot of that is coming to have some substance to it.
Yeah, it's amazing, isn't it? Uris in Madison has something for us. Let's go there. Uris, hi, thanks for calling.
Yes, hello. I have a couple of lemon trees I grew from seed, and they do fine, but they are losing regularly leaves, and I wonder if it's related to, I fertilize it with some citrus fertilizer, powder form, and dissolve it in water and then fertilize it. But how often, I'm not quite sure. And then if losing the leaves is normal, and it seems like the water isn't really the issue, it's the fertilizer maybe, but the color of the rest of the tree looks good. And it's just certain leaves, it drops regularly, the leaves drop. And that's my question, what I could do.
Okay.
Well, my guess would be that the leaf drop is probably heavier this time of year, and it's because of lower light conditions. They need a lot of light in order to hold on to their leaves, and when there's not enough light, the plants will drop some of their leaves. But also leaf drop is natural throughout the year because even if a plant is evergreen, like a citrus, it doesn't mean that one leaf is going to live forever. The older leaves towards the inside of the plant will drop occasionally. But if I was you, I would make sure you do not fertilize during the winter at all. The plant doesn't really need extra food when it's in kind of a dormant stage or a resting period until, I would say, your first feeding, you'd probably want as the days get longer and the temperatures warm up. So maybe the end of April, 1st of May, and then once a month till about August would be fine. And it really doesn't need much more than that. Also cut back on the water during the winter, unless you have it in a room where you've got gas heat and the temperatures are dry, then you might want to set it in a saucer with pebbles on the bottom to try to increase the humidity around the plants.
Yeah. And as for the leaves, my own experience with citrus is that the leaves always dropped in the fall off of my lime tree, and the tree would then make new leaves that were a different kind of leaf. I think to make up for the difference in the lack of light or the lower light conditions. Really, the leaves that come back have a quite different look and texture and so forth than the leaves that that may be dying off on you right now.
Yeah, the leaves have a waxy layer called a cuticle, and the cuticle's a protective layer to keep the leaves from being burned in the light. So it reduces the amount of light actually coming into the plant. When the plant gets moved indoors, because of the thick cuticle, the plant's not getting enough light. So those leaves with a thicker cuticle will drop, and then the new ones that come out will have a thinner cuticle. But then it's also important to remember in the spring that you don't want to put it right into the sun, because it would be like you going to the beach with in the spring without any suntan lotion on. You would burn. The same thing would happen to these leaves with a thinner cuticle.
There you go, Aris. Thank you so much for calling. Appreciate your call. Don in Bayfield has a question. Let's go to Don. Hi, Don.
Hi. Are African violets considered succulents?
No, African violets are in a family called gesneriads, and they some of the leaves have a succulent quality to them, but they're not true succulents, so they're not drought tolerant. And different species in that family have more succulent characteristics. Not so much the violet, but the stems on it, do hold a lot of water. So if you cut a stem, and squeeze it, you can feel the moist characteristics of it.
Yeah. Don, did you have another question relating to that?
Super info. Thank you.
All right. Thanks a lot for calling. Appreciate your call. Someone else is wondering, why don't succulents need a lot of water?
Well, they have water. This is one of the fascinating things about how plants adapt to their environment all over the world. And succulents and cacti have developed in dry climates where they have to survive without long periods of water. So they have water storing capabilities within the plant. The cells can hold a lot of water during dry periods. Another unique thing that they have is, I don't want to scare anybody, but it's called crassulacean acid metabolism. and that's just the kind of the opposite of the way normal plants take in carbon dioxide. A lot of the succulents will have their stomata closed during the day, so they're not using carbon dioxide, but they'll open them at night. And because they're closed during the day, the plant's not losing water. So they've made these adaptations to grow in dry areas.
Really interesting. Carol in Madison emailed, she seems to struggle with fuzzy succulents. Hers seem to go yellow and die off around the edges most of the year. What's the general rule for light with these types of succulents? Do you have any other advice for care of these plants?
Yeah, it depends on the succulent. Usually fuzzy succulents have adapted, and cacti, have adapted the fuzziness to stop them from burning. So they're native to areas with high light intensity, high sun intensity, and the fuzziness will protect them. So those are going to be less likely to do well indoors, where you need higher lights. Indoors, you might want to use things like Hayworthias or Gasterias or Sansevieria. Things like true cactus really don't do well indoors. they'll get a lot of etiolated growth without the lights. So if you are growing cactus indoors, the one thing you want to remember is that you're just going to try to keep it alive through the winter until spring comes. So keep it in a window with as much light as possible, cut back on the fertilizer and the water, and cross your fingers and hope that they survive till spring.
Do all cacti have thorns?
Yes, and only cactus have thorns. Succulents don't. Cactus, there's no cactus native to the Old World. They're all New World plants. But the Old World does have succulents, and they have spines like euphorbias and things like that, but they're not true cactus.
Yeah. What's the purpose of the thorns?
To keep people from eating them, or keep animals from eating them.
Yeah.
Yeah, and of course, I should have answered your question more specifically. Not all cactus have thorns. There are epiphyllums, of course, that have no thorns. The Christmas cactus is probably one of the more common ones, but those cactus are native to wetter areas.
Annette in Green Bay has a question for us. Let's go there. Hi, Annette.
Yes, hi, good morning. Well, good afternoon. And maybe you just mentioned the word epithelium. Those are, I bought a couple of them, and they get really long, lanky leaves, and then they flower perhaps at night. Did I say that correctly? And I'm just wondering about the care for them. Can they handle some sun, or do they have to just be in the shade?
Well, yeah, you're correct. They're epiphyllum, and they're native to rainforests, like areas in Brazil and the Amazon. And they're epiphytic in nature, which means that they don't grow on the ground, they grow in trees. And because they grow in trees, they have perfect drainage. So they do need a lot of light, but direct sun could burn the leaves. If they were in the house, that's probably not as much of a problem. When you put them outdoors in the spring, in summer, probably an eastern exposure would be best for them, where they could get the morning sun, but not hot enough to burn the leaves. And some of the species are night blooming. But most of them bloom during the day, and the blooms usually only last 1 day or 2 days. But they're really spectacular when they do bloom. And usually the bloom is dependent on them getting enough light during the winter.
Makes sense. Annette, thank you so much for calling. Let's go to Jerry in Kokana. Hi, Jerry.
Yes, hello. Quick question. I have an aloe plant that probably should have been transplanted long ago, and that stem, I guess you'd call it, is kind of below the leaves part. It's sticking out of the plant about 5-6 inches, and it's kind of starting to twist too, probably trying to go towards the sun or something. How would I transplant something like that?
Well, if I was you, I'd wait till spring to transplant, because it is kind of in a resting state right now. And the important thing to remember when you transplant would be to use a quick draining soil. You can get cactus and succulent mixes specifically, but you can use any type of houseplant soil if you mix 50% perlite with it. Perlite or pumice, so half that and half potting soil mixed up would give you a good mix for that. And that little trunk you're talking about is natural as aloes get older. There's some tree aloes that get to be like 20 feet tall and have trunks with just that aloe part that you see up on top. So that's kind of natural as the plant ages.
Oh, interesting. Thank you, Jerry, for calling. Appreciate it. Jim in Kenosha Your turn. Hi, Jim.
Hi, I love this show. I wanted to start a discussion about how these plants in the desert know when the seeds know when to germinate, because if they germinate on just a little bit of moisture, they'll pop up and die. And some seeds have they have this wonderful design where they can sense the salinity of the water. So if there's just a little bit of rain swishing up the mud and stuff, it's not enough. But if there's a torrent in the desert, the water will dilute and the seeds can sense that low salinity, and then they'll bloom. Now, I read this article a long time ago, but I can't remember what plants they're talking about, and I hope you can include this in the discussion because it's very fascinating.
Yeah, interesting, Jim. Thanks. John, are you familiar with any of that?
Yeah, it's amazing how plants know when they should germinate and when they shouldn't. And a lot of times the germination is controlled by more than one factor. Like I believe it was Jim was just talking about, sometimes it can be the amount of water or the salinity of the water, but sometimes coupled with that, it's day length also. So the plant knows just when it is to germinate. Fortunately, the cactus and succulents don't get tricked very often because you have a rainy season and a not rainy season.
Yeah.
Here in Southern California, we haven't. The last time it rained significantly here was 10 months ago. So we've gone virtually 10 months with no rain. And a lot of the plants just, are trying to hold on and survive until the rains come.
And I should have asked you earlier. You're in Southern California. You're away from the fires there?
Yeah, we're in San Diego, so LA's about an hour and a half from us. And unfortunately, right now there's no abatement to those fires. They're only about less than 10% contained. So our hearts and prayers go out to the people who are experiencing that.
John Bagnasco, our guest today, been in the gardening industry over 50 years, president of Garden America. It's a nationally syndicated radio show. Great to have him with us. Questions for John? I hope you'll join in. Number to call, 800-642-1234, or you could email us to talk@wpr.org. I'm Larry Mueller for Garden Talk and WPR News. Great to have you with us here on WPR News. Larry Mueller here. Next week on Garden Talk, we'll take a look at garden design trends for 2025 with a trend spotter from Monrovia. We'll also talk about the best way to provide light for your indoor plants. Right now, visiting with John Bagnasco, who is a garden expert, over 50 years of experience, president of Garden America, a nationally syndicated radio show. And again, if you have a question, I hope you'll join us at 800-642-1234, or you could email us to talk@wpr.org. That's talk@wpr.org. Jim wanted to know about tips you might have for getting succulents to bloom.
Almost always it's going to be dependent on the amount of light that they get. And depending on what family or what genus the succulent is in, you might want to just Google some information on when the bloom time is for that particular plant. Plants that are going to bloom during the summer are probably going to be more likely to bloom. But winter blooming plants may not bloom as easily indoors because they would be exposed to more light in their native habitats. Yeah. So kind of try to figure out the seasons and the times. And then I remember back in Michigan trying to make sure that the Christmas cactus would bloom on time or would bloom at all. That that one of the things that triggered the bloom there was the cooler temperatures. So usually you would try to keep them in an unheated porch until they set buds. So it's important to learn where the plant is native to and what does trigger the bloom. But using a high bloom fertilizer or, trying to fertilize, it's not going to help cactus or succulents bloom.
Elka, who is in Empire, Michigan, has a question. Let's go there. That relates to blooming, I believe. Hi, Elka.
Hello.
Huh?
I have a question about what I'm supposed to do in the summertime.
Okay, and what do you have?
I have a Hoya, and it's quite big, and it's doing all the things it's supposed to do to bloom. There must be something I'm not doing right because I hardly get any bloom. What am I now? Am I supposed to put it in a dark area now in the winter?
No. Always give the Hoyas as much light as possible. But a tip to remember is when the Hoya does bloom, that when the blooms fall off, don't cut that little stem because it's always going to bloom from that same spot. So if you cut that off when it's done blooming, you're cutting off future blooms for that. So always leave those on, and then give it as much light as possible all year long, except in the winter. Now keep it on the dry side, but still as much light as possible. But only water it when it gets dry, really dry.
Grow lights might be useful in that case in Empire, Michigan, I would perhaps think, John.
Grow lights, I think, Larry, would be good for any cactus or succulent during the winter if you had them. It's not going to put them under natural growing conditions, but it is going to make the winter less difficult for them to get through. So, yeah, great idea.
And we'll be talking more about grow lights and lighting in general on next Friday's program, as a matter of fact. Dot in Chippewa Falls, we'll go to you. Hi, Dot.
Hi. I have a Hindu rope plant. They also call it a Carnosa compacta, and it's 10 to 12 feet long. But it's very hard to move it because it's a hanging plant, and I want to find the best way to clean it.
Well, that's a Hoya. It's, as you said, Hoya carnosa compacta, and that's what we were just talking about. One of the problems with that is that particular plant is the leaves are so twisted that it's easy for dust and then a buildup of insects to hide in those crevices and those twists and turns. So if you can't move it, that's kind of difficult for cleaning it. If you could, of course, you could take it and put it in the bathtub or the shower, not necessarily to water the pot itself, but just to hose down the leaves. They're waxy leaves, so getting a stream of water in there will wash out and keep it clean. And it's also going to, it's really going to help keeping it free of insects. But that's something you have to be careful of. If you do have mealybug, which is common on those, we were talking earlier about dipping a Q-tip in rubbing alcohol and then just rubbing that off, so that'll help. But that's a plant that's fascinated me ever since I was a kid. And when they bloom, the blooms are so fragrant. The same holds true. Like we were talking to the previous caller about, once they bloom, make sure that you don't cut off that stem because it's always going to bloom from that spot.
Yeah. Dot, there you go. Thank you so much for calling. Appreciate it. Well, we have an email from Deb in Sturgeon Bay and Tucson. She's in Arizona right now, in Tucson, and then in May they come back to Wisconsin. They have a small area in front of their Tucson home and would like to put in some cactuses. They don't want to have to water it while they're not there. Is there a cactus you can recommend that can handle some tender loving care for the first 4 months, but then be left alone until they return in the fall?
Well, you know, the iconic symbol of Arizona is the saguaro cactus, and they never need any care once they're planted. You can put them in the ground, and they'll take care of themselves. You don't have to do a single thing to them. And there's other plants that are succulents that are blooming, like ocotillos, which get the pretty red flowers in the spring, probably while they're still out there, that they could put that, you know, once they're established, again, they need no care whatsoever. So one thing I might recommend is driving around the neighborhood and looking and see what other people have in their yards, and it'll just give you an idea of what might grow, and seeing it in another yard will give you an idea of what it would look like in your yard.
Yeah. I have some family members living in Tucson, and the ocotillos there, there's very pretty plants in my mind, and don't seem to require a whole lot of care, to be perfectly honest. And the saguaro, I know there was, are they commercially available? Do you know off the top of your head, John? I know there was some problems with, at one point, a lot of them being, you know, pirated out of the desert and then resold.
Well, that's the larger ones, yeah, and that's going to be a problem. You don't want to buy anything that's been illegally harvested, but you can even order those online if the local garden center doesn't have them. They're grown from seed and readily available. You know, for your listeners, Altman Plants is the world's largest cactus grower, and they're based actually all over the country, but they have cactus growing areas in I believe Texas, Florida, and California. But if you go to Amazon and just look for Altman Plants, they've got a great online store, and I believe you can even order, you know, small saguaros from them. But I think your person in Tucson would want to start with a little larger one. So I think they'll be available in maybe like a 5-gallon can, which would be perfect for letting it survive while they're gone.
Yeah. So Altman's is a good place to buy. Are they good for, you know, I'm thinking about resources for buying unusual succulents, you know, taking some chances.
The two breeders that I mentioned earlier, Kelly Griffin and Renee O'Connell, are breeders for Altman Plants. And you can probably look Kelly Griffin up on the internet. He may have a website, or there certainly will be cactus and succulent websites that talk about him and all the new plants that he's coming out with. But yeah, the Altman's is by far going to be the best selection, I would say, in the country.
Yeah. Well, from low care succulents to maybe high care roses, your interests are certainly varied. And how did you just get into breeding roses?
Well, you know, earlier in the show we were talking about how to break down the horticultural gardening world, I studied one section of plants at a time. And about 20 years ago, I got into roses, and now I'm to the age where I can't really change. So I'm just sticking with that. And it was just, there's so much to know about roses. That's another hour show for us to talk about. But the history behind them is unbelievable. And you can learn so much about history, and there's so many types, and there's so much breeding going on today that I just thought that it would be interesting to do. So that's how I got into that.
Well, yeah, we'll get you back to talk about roses. What does it mean to be a breeder? I mean, what do you do?
Well, I look at breeding breeding to me is a form of art. You've got a painter or a sculptor, and they're working with oils or stone to create something for you to use. Well, breeders are just working with a natural media. They're working with living material in creating something new. So I think in any species of plant, the breeder has in mind characteristics he would want to use in order to create a new plant with new characteristics. And so I've always looked at breeders as just artists working in a living medium.
Carol in Waukesha has a quick little note for us, I think. Hi, Carol.
Hi. Yeah, I lived in Tucson for 10 years and was active 20 years. I was active with the Tucson Cactus and Succulent Society. They rescue plants from the bulldozers, and they have sales several times a year of all sizes, mostly barrels and smaller cactus, but you never know.
Yeah.
Also, the Home Depot, the big box stores have local saguaros in 5-gallon pots.
Carol, thank you for calling. So the Cactus Rescue Society, another place to purchase cactus for our earlier emailer there from it was Deb in Sturgeon Bay in Tucson. So thank you very much for that. The radio show, how's the radio show going?
It's doing really well. We changed our format a couple years ago, and it's much easier for us to do. Now we do the show live on Facebook at 8 o'clock Pacific time, which I think would be 10 o'clock Central time. And you can interact with the show live on Facebook, and we record that show and then put the commercials in later, and we send it out to radio stations across the country the following week. So if you are in a city that gets the show, you're hearing it a week late. But if you want to interact and do it live, just go to Garden America Radio Show on Facebook, and we're there. It'll be starting at 10 o'clock your time.
Well, here I've been doing this show. I'm on every weekday, but Fridays are always garden days, and it's always fun to be able to talk to gardeners, and we have some pretty smart ones here in Wisconsin. And if you make a mistake or you don't know something, pretty much you just have to wait a few minutes, and somebody's going to call in with the answer.
Yeah, it's always amazing how much listeners know. Never underestimate their knowledge.
It's a lot of fun to do, and I enjoy it, and it sure sounds like you enjoy it too. You're going to keep doing it, I'm sure.
As long as God lets me do it, I plan on being active in it.
John, a pleasure. We'll try and get you back to talk roses. Would you be willing to do that?
Not only would I be willing, it might have to be 2 hours.
There we go. John, thank you so much.
Thank you, Larry.
Yeah, John Bagnasco, the gardening industry for a long, long time, president of Garden America, a nationally syndicated radio show. And if you want to give a listen to that, why not? Give it a try and see how you like it. Well, great to have you listening in today. These and all our shows are a team effort. Our producers, Joe Patnaud, Clara Neipert, our technical directors, Lee Rayburn and Jeff Robbins. Our executive producer is Jill Nadeau, and I, of course, am Larry Mueller, and I'm always pleased to do this program myself. Thank you so much for listening, and please stay with us. Lots more in store here on WPR News.